The handcuffs clicked shut on the wrists of a 7-3-year-old man as neighbors pressed against police tape, mouths hanging open in disbelief. This wasn't some stranger being dragged from a crack house. This was their neighbor, the guy who'd coached their kids in Little League, the man who'd fixed their broken door hinges without asking for a dime, the friendly face who smiled at them every Sunday at church. And in November 2009, he was being arrested for murder. But to understand how we got here, how an entire community could be so catastrophically wrong about someone, we need to go back 43 years. Back to a frigid November night in 1966, when two-year-old Rosaline Santoro walked out of the Silver Moon Diner after her evening shift, pulling her coat tight against the Michigan cold. She waved goodbye to the cook, turned toward home, and vanished into the darkness. She would never be seen alive again. And the man who made her disappear, he'd spend the next 3 decades living right under their noses. Before we dive in, drop a comment and tell me, where are you watching from? Manistee, Michigan in 1966 was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and that wasn't always a bad thing. Nestled along the shores of Lake Michigan, this working-class community of about 7,000 souls thrived on lumber mills, commercial fishing, and the kind of neighborly bonds that made people feel safe, leaving their doors unlocked at night. Kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. Families gathered at Friday night football games. The local diner was where deals were made, gossip was traded, and waitresses like Rosaline Santoro kept the coffee flowing and the conversation light. Rosaline, or Rosie, to nearly everyone who knew her, was a fixture at the Silver Moon Diner on River Street. She'd been slinging hash and pouring coffee there since she graduated from Manistee High School 4 years earlier. At 22, she had that effortless charm that made truckers leave bigger tips and made lonely old-timers linger over a second slice of pie just to hear her laugh. She wasn't trying to be anyone's sweetheart. She was just rosy, dark-haired, quick-witted, with a smile that could disarm even the grumpiest customer on a Monday morning. Born and raised in Manistee, Rosaline was the middle child of 3. Her father, Vincent Santoro, worked at the Manistee Iron Works, putting in long shifts at the foundry to keep his family fed. Her mother, Dorothy, was a homemaker who ran a tight ship. Sunday dinners were mandatory, church attendance was non-negotiable, and curfew was curfew, no exceptions. Rosaline's older brother, Frank, had enlisted in the army and was stationed in Germany. Her younger sister, Marie, was still in high school, wrapped up in cheerleading practice and dreams of becoming a teacher. The Santoro family wasn't wealthy, but they were solid, respectable, the kind of people you'd trust to watch your house while you were out of town. Rosie had dreams too. She'd been saving money from her waitressing gig, tucking away dollar bills in a cigar box under her bed, hoping to eventually enroll in a secretarial program at the community college over in Ludington. She wanted more than the diner, not because she was ashamed of the work, but because she wanted options, independence, a life beyond the breakfast rush and the smell of bacon grease that clung to her uniform no matter how many times she washed it. She'd recently started dating a guy named Tommy Callahan, a mechanic who worked at Benson's garage on the south side of town. It wasn't serious, at least not yet, but her sister Marie would tease her about the way Rosie lit up whenever Tommy's Chevy rumbled up to the curb. They'd gone to the movies twice. He'd bought her a Coke at the soda fountain. It was sweet, innocent, the kind of small-town romance that felt like it had all the time in the world to blossom. But time, as it turned out, was something Rosaline Santoro didn't have. Her routine was predictable, maybe too predictable. She worked the evening shift at the Silver Moon 4 nights a week, Tuesday through Friday, clocking out at 10 p.m. The walk home wasn't far, just 8 blocks through quiet residential streets. She'd done it hundreds of times. Her parents didn't worry. Why would they? This was Manistee. Nothing bad happened here. On the night of November 17th, 1966, everything seemed normal. Rosie had worked her usual shift. She'd joked with the cook, a gruff Korean war vet named Pete, about the customer who'd ordered his eggs scrambled, but not too scrambled. She'd pocketed $4.50 in tips, a decent haul for a Thursday night. She'd untied her apron, grabbed her coat from the hook by the kitchen, and pushed through the diner's front door into the cold. Pete watched her go. He'd later tell police he saw her turn left onto River Street, heading toward Maple, her usual route home. She had her hands shoved in her coat pockets. Her breath made little clouds in the freezing air. That was the last confirmed sighting of Rosaline Santoro. Somewhere between the Silver Moon Diner and the modest two-story house on Oak Street, where her parents were probably watching The Tonight Show and waiting for the sound of her key in the lock, Rosaline disappeared. No scream, no struggle witnessed, no signs of a confrontation. She simply vanished. And when the sun rose over Lake Michigan the next morning, the Santoro family's worst nightmare was just beginning. Dorothy Santoro wasn't the type to panic easily. She'd raised 3 kids through scraped knees, late-night fevers, and teenage rebellion. She knew the difference between real trouble and the kind of worry that dissolves with the morning light. But when she woke at 6 a.m. on Friday, November 18th, and found Rosaline's bed, untouched sheets still tucked tight, pillows still perfectly fluffed, a cold dread settled in her chest. She checked the bathroom. Empty. She checked the kitchen. No note. She walked through every room of the house twice, as if Rosaline might somehow materialize from behind a door or around a corner. Vincent was already awake, pulling on his work boots, confused by his wife's frantic energy. "She never came home," Dorothy said, her voice trembling. "Vinny, she never came home." Vincent Santoro called the Manistee Police Department at 6:47 a.m. The officer who answered tried to be reassuring. Young women sometimes stayed out late. Maybe she'd gone to a friend's house. Maybe she'd had car trouble and stayed somewhere overnight. Had they tried calling her friends? But Rosaline didn't drive. She walked, and she always came home. By 8 a.m., Vincent was at the Silver Moon Diner, demanding answers. Pete, the cook, confirmed what Vincent already knew. Rosie had left right on schedule at 10 p.m. She'd seemed fine, happy even. She'd grabbed her coat and walked out into the night like she'd done 100 times before. Tommy Callahan, the mechanic she'd been seeing, was tracked down at Benson's garage. He hadn't seen her. They hadn't made plans for Thursday night. He seemed genuinely confused and genuinely worried. By noon, word had spread through Manistee like wildfire. Rosie Santoro was missing. The Manistee Police Department, a small force of just 12 officers, mobilized quickly. Chief Harold Wickham assigned Detective Raymond Kowalski to lead the investigation. Kowalski was a 15-year veteran, a no-nonsense cop who'd worked everything from drunk and disorderlies to the occasional bar fight. But a missing person, a young woman who'd vanished without a trace, this was different. Search parties formed almost immediately. Volunteers combed River Street, Maple Avenue, and every alley, yard, and empty lot along Rosaline's usual walking route. They checked behind dumpsters, under porches, inside abandoned sheds. They knocked on doors, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual Thursday night. Nothing. The temperature had dropped to 28 degrees that night. If Rosaline had gotten hurt, collapsed somewhere, exposure alone could have killed her within hours. That terrifying possibility drove searchers to move faster, look harder. Bloodhounds were brought in from the county sheriff's office. They picked up Rosaline's scent at the diner, followed it down River Street for 3 blocks, and then lost it completely at the corner of River and Maple. It was as if she'd been plucked off the street by invisible hands. Detective Kowalski retraced her steps himself, walking the route at night under similar conditions. 8 blocks, residential streets, streetlights every 50 yards, houses with front porches and curtained windows. Someone should have seen something, but no one had, or at least no one was saying they had. By the weekend, the Michigan State Police had been called in. Flyers with Rosaline's photograph were distributed to every business in town. Local radio stations broadcast descriptions every hour. The Manistee News Advocate ran her picture on the front page with the headline, "Local Woman Missing Family Pleads for Information." Dorothy and Vincent Santoro gave a tearful interview, begging anyone with information to come forward. "She's a good girl," Dorothy said, her voice breaking. "She didn't run away. She didn't have any reason to leave. Something happened to her. Please, if you know anything at all, please help us bring her home." Theories began to circulate. Had she been abducted? Had someone been watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike? Had she been the victim of a random act of violence, wrong place, wrong time? Had she gotten into a car with someone she knew, someone she trusted, only to realize too late that she'd made a fatal mistake? Detective Kowalski interviewed dozens of people, co-workers, friends, customers who'd been at the diner that night. He spoke to every man who'd ever shown interest in Rosaline, including Tommy Callahan, who was questioned twice and cleared both times. His alibi was solid. He'd been home with his mother, who confirmed he'd been in bed by 9:30 p.m. Investigators checked for signs of a struggle along her route. They found nothing: no torn clothing, no blood, no purse, no wallet. Rosaline had simply evaporated into the November darkness. Weeks turned into months. The searches grew smaller. The tips dried up. The case, once the only thing anyone in Manistee could talk about, began to fade from daily conversation. Not because people stopped caring, but because there was nothing left to say. No answers, no closure, just a gaping hole where a young woman used to be. And somewhere, someone knew exactly what had happened. Someone who walked those same streets. Someone who heard the whispers, saw the flyers, watched the Santoro family crumble under the weight of not knowing. Someone who said nothing. If you're finding this story as haunting as I am, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We cover cases like this every week, and your support helps us shine a light on stories that deserve to be told. Detective Raymond Kowalski had worked cases that kept him up at night, but nothing like this. In a town the size of Manistee, violent crime was rare. A missing woman, especially one who'd vanished mid-stride on a quiet residential street, was unheard of. And the complete absence of evidence, that was the part that gnawed at him. No body, no witnesses, no physical evidence, no crime scene. Just a ghost story in the making. Kowalski was methodical. He built a timeline, mapping out every confirmed sighting of Rosaline on November 17th. She'd arrived at the Silver Moon Diner at 4:45 p.m. for her shift. Multiple customers remembered seeing her throughout the evening. Pete, the cook, confirmed she'd left at 10 p.m., same as always. 3 people reported seeing a young woman matching Rosaline's description walking along River Street between 10:05 and 10:15 p.m. One witness, an elderly man walking his dog, specifically remembered her because she'd smiled and said, "Cold one tonight, huh?" That was 3 blocks from the diner. After that, nothing. Kowalski worked the case from every conceivable angle. He interviewed over 150 people in the first 3 months alone. Friends, family, co-workers, neighbors, anyone who might have seen something, heard something, or known something. He investigated every man who'd ever shown interest in Rosaline. Tommy Callahan, her boyfriend, remained a person of interest initially, but his alibi held firm. His mother swore he'd been home. A neighbor corroborated it. Kowalski wanted to push harder, but the evidence, or lack of it, pointed elsewhere. There was a drifter who'd been spotted near the diner 2 nights before Rosaline disappeared. Police tracked him to Grand Rapids, questioned him, and cleared him. He'd been working a construction job 70 miles away the night Rosaline vanished. A local man with a history of peeping Tom complaints was brought in for questioning. He had no alibi, but he also had no connection to Rosaline. His home and vehicle were searched. Nothing. A trucker who'd been a regular at the Silver Moon Diner was interviewed twice. He'd made comments to other waitresses about Rosaline being easy on the eyes. Investigators checked his logbooks. He'd been hauling a load to Milwaukee that night. His route didn't match up. Every lead fizzled. Every suspect cleared. Kowalski even considered the possibility that Rosaline had staged her own disappearance, run away to escape something or someone. But her family insisted it was impossible. She had no reason to run. She was saving money for school. She was happy. Her belongings were all still at home, including the cigar box under her bed with $127 tucked inside. People don't run away and leave their life savings behind. Forensic technology in 1966 was primitive by modern standards. There was no DNA testing, no security cameras, no cell phone records. Fingerprinting required a surface to lift prints from, and there was no surface. Blood analysis required blood, and there was no blood. Kowalski was working blind. The Michigan State Police offered assistance, bringing in additional manpower and resources. They conducted aerial searches of the surrounding woods and shoreline. Divers searched the Manistee River. Cadaver dogs were deployed in nearby forested areas. Still, nothing. The case consumed Kowalski. He stopped sleeping more than a few hours a night. His wife begged him to step back, to let someone else take over, but he couldn't. Somewhere out there was a killer, or at the very least, answers, and he was determined to find them. But as winter gave way to spring, and spring gave way to summer, the tips stopped coming. The case stalled. And then it went cold. The impact on Manistee was profound. Parents started driving their kids to school instead of letting them walk. Women refused to go out alone after dark. Doors that had never been locked suddenly had deadbolts installed. The small-town trust that had defined Manistee for generations was replaced by suspicion and fear. Who did this? Was it someone local? Was it someone they all knew? The Manistee News Advocate covered the case extensively in the early months. But by mid-1967, stories about Rosaline had moved from the front page to page 3, then page 7, then not at all. The public's attention drifted, not out of cruelty but out of exhaustion. There was nothing new to report. For the Santoro family, the silence was unbearable. Dorothy stopped going to church. She couldn't stand the pitying looks, the whispered prayers, the well-meaning neighbors who'd ask if there was any news when they knew damn well there wasn't. Vincent threw himself into his work at the foundry, putting in overtime shifts just to avoid coming home to a house haunted by his daughter's absence. Marie, Rosaline's younger sister, struggled through her senior year of high school in a fog of grief and guilt. She'd been the last family member to see Rosie alive, they'd argued that morning over something stupid, something Marie couldn't even remember now. She never got to say she was sorry. By 1970, the case was unofficially dead. Kowalski retired in 1974, never having solved it. He kept a copy of Rosaline's case file at home, pulling it out every few years to review, hoping something would click. It never did. The file was transferred to storage, where it gathered dust alongside dozens of other forgotten cases. Rosaline Santoro became a name in a box. A cautionary tale, parents told their daughters. A cold case with no answers. And whoever killed her, they were free. Free to live. Free to blend in. Free to become someone else. Real quick, what time is it where you are? Are you watching this alone or with someone? Let me know in the comments. Time has a strange way of softening even the sharpest wounds. Not healing them, never truly healing, but dulling the edges just enough to let people function, to let a town move forward even when a piece of its soul is still missing. By the mid-1970s, Manistee had learned to live with the unanswered question of Rosaline Santoro. New families moved in. Kids who'd never known Rosie graduated from high school. The diner changed ownership. Life, as it always does, continued. But the Santoro family never moved on. Dorothy Santoro spent the rest of her life waiting for a phone call that never came. Every time the phone rang, every time there was a knock at the door, a flicker of desperate hope crossed her face. Maybe today would be the day they'd find her. Maybe today she'd finally know what happened to her daughter. She died in 1989 without ever getting that answer. Vincent lived longer, but not better. He became a quiet, hollowed-out version of the man he'd once been. He'd sit on his porch in the evenings, staring down Oak Street as if Rosaline might still come walking home. Neighbors would wave. He'd nod back. But the light behind his eyes had gone out decades earlier. Marie, the younger sister, left Manistee in 1970 and never came back. She couldn't bear it. Couldn't walk past the diner where Rosie had worked. Couldn't drive down River Street without imagining her sister's last steps. She moved to Ohio, got married, had kids, and built a life that didn't revolve around loss. But every November 17th, without fail, she'd light a candle and whisper her sister's name. The case itself remained officially open, but in practical terms, it was dead. New detectives inherited the file over the years, flipped through it during slow weeks, and inevitably reached the same conclusion. Without a body, without witnesses, without evidence, there was nothing to investigate. Cold cases didn't get the attention they do now. There were no specialized units, no TV shows glamorizing forensic breakthroughs, no online databases, just boxes of paper files in a basement storage room, slowly yellowing with age. But while the Santoro family lived in limbo, someone else in Manistee was thriving. His name was Walter Hutchins, and if you'd asked anyone in town about him, you'd have heard the same things over and over. Salt of the earth, nicest guy you'd ever meet, pillar of the community. Walter owned Hutchins Hardware on Main Street, a store that had been a local fixture since the early 1972s. It was the kind of place where you could buy a hammer, a bag of nails, and get free advice on how to fix your leaky faucet, all while Walt told you a story that'd make you laugh until your sides hurt. He wasn't originally from Manistee. He'd moved to town in 1968, just a couple years after Rosaline disappeared, and opened the hardware store not long after. People appreciated that a young guy with ambition, willing to invest in a small town when so many others were leaving for the cities. Walt became part of the fabric of Manistee. He sponsored the Little League team for over 20 years. Kids wore jerseys with Hutchins hardware stitched across the back. Parents would see Walt in the stands at every game, cheering louder than anyone, handing out ice cream sandwiches after wins and losses alike. He was a deacon at First Baptist Church, the guy who showed up early to unlock the doors and stayed late to help fold the chairs. He organized the church's annual charity drive. He visited shut-ins. He donated tools to the high school's shop class. When someone's furnace died in the middle of February, Walt would drop everything and drive over with a space heater, refusing payment. When a single mom couldn't afford supplies to fix her busted porch step, Walt would show up with the materials and do the work himself. He never married. "Guess I'm just married to the store," he'd joke. People thought it was a little sad, such a good man, never finding someone to share his life with, but he seemed content, happy, even. Walt knew everyone, and everyone knew Walt. He'd been there when their kids took their first swings at a baseball. He'd sold them the tools to build their decks and fix their roofs. He'd sat beside them in church for 30 years. He'd smiled at them every Sunday. He'd fixed their broken door hinges without asking for a dime. And no one, not once, not ever, suspected a thing, because why would they? Walter Hutchins was exactly what he appeared to be, a good, decent, reliable man who'd chosen to make Manistee his home. Meanwhile, every few years, the case of Rosaline Santoro would get a brief mention in the local paper, usually around the anniversary of her disappearance. A detective might give a quote, "We haven't forgotten. If anyone has information, it's never too late to come forward." But no one ever did. The truth was buried so deep, hidden so well, that it seemed like it would stay that way forever, until technology caught up with the past. Stories like Rosaline's remind us why we can't let these cases fade into obscurity. If this is your first time here, smash that like button. It tells YouTube to share this story with more people who care about justice. Detective Sarah Brennan had never met Rosaline Santoro, but she felt like she knew her. Brennan joined the Manistee Police Department in 2005, more than 40 years after Rosaline vanished. By then, the case was ancient history, a tragic footnote in the department's records. But in 2007, when Brennan was assigned to the newly formed Cold Case Review Unit, a fancy name for what was essentially her and one file cabinet, Rosaline's case was one of the first she pulled. Something about it haunted her. Maybe it was the way Rosaline had simply evaporated. Maybe it was the thought of Dorothy Santoro dying without answers. Maybe it was the fact that somewhere out there, a killer had gotten away with it for 4 decades. Whatever the reason, Brennan couldn't let it go. The problem was, there wasn't much to work with. The original evidence collected in 1966 was minimal. Some witness statements, photographs of the search areas, a few items from Rosaline's locker at the diner. But buried in the evidence log, Brennan found something interesting. A reference to biological samples held in evidence storage. She tracked them down. In a dusty box in the basement of the county courthouse, labeled and forgotten, were 2 evidence bags. One contained a scarf. The other contained fingernail clippings taken during the autopsy. Wait, autopsy. Brennan dug deeper into the file and found a report she'd initially missed. In March 1967, 4 months after Rosaline disappeared, a body had been discovered in a wooded area about 12 miles outside Manistee, near the Manistee National Forest. Decomposition was advanced, but dental records confirmed it. Rosaline Santoro. She'd been strangled. The case had technically been reclassified from missing person to homicide, but with no suspects and no leads, it had still gone nowhere. The evidence from the scene, including skin cells found under Rosaline's fingernails, had been preserved, catalogued, and stored for over 40 years. Brennan stared at those evidence bags and felt her pulse quicken. In 1967, DNA testing didn't exist, but in 2008, it was revolutionizing cold case investigations across the country. Detectives were solving decades-old murders by retesting evidence with technology that would have seemed like science fiction to the original investigators. Brennan knew this was a long shot. DNA degrades over time. The samples were old, really old. There was no guarantee they'd yield anything usable. But she had to try. She sent the evidence to the Michigan State Police Forensic Laboratory with a formal request for DNA analysis. The process wasn't fast. Funding for cold cases was always tight, and the lab had a backlog. Brennan was told it could take 6 months, maybe longer. She waited and waited. Months dragged by. Brennan checked in regularly, trying not to sound too desperate. But the lab technicians were consistent. "We're working on it. These things take time." Finally, in August 2009, she got the call. They'd isolated a DNA profile. The skin cells under Rosaline's fingernails had yielded a partial male DNA profile. It wasn't perfect, there were gaps, degradation, but it was enough to run through CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, which catalogs DNA profiles from convicted offenders across the country. Brennan held her breath as the search ran. No match. Her heart sank. CODIS was the gold standard for solving cold cases. If the killer's DNA wasn't in the system, they were back to square one. But the lab technician had another suggestion. Run the profile through the Michigan State DNA database, which included not just convicted felons, but also arrestees and certain voluntary submissions. It was a smaller pool, but worth a shot. 3 days later, Brennan got another call. "We got a hit." She almost dropped the phone. The DNA matched a sample in the Michigan database, a voluntary submission from a man who'd provided his DNA during a minor criminal inquiry years earlier. Nothing had come of that inquiry. He'd never been charged. But his DNA had stayed in the system. The lab tech read the name over the phone. Walter Hutchins. Brennan's blood ran cold. Walt Hutchins, the hardware store guy, the Little League sponsor, the man half the town considered a living saint? She must have heard wrong. She asked the tech to repeat it. Walter Allen Hutchins. Date of birth, the 9th of April, 1936. Address, 412, Spruce Lane, Manistee. It was him. Brennan sat in stunned silence for a long moment, trying to process what she'd just heard. She'd seen Walter Hutchins around town dozens of times. She'd bought a wrench from his store just last month. He'd helped her find the right size and cracked a joke about her over-tightening everything. And now she was staring at a report that said his DNA had been found under a murdered woman's fingernails. She immediately called the Michigan State Police to request independent verification. This was too big, too explosive, to get wrong. A second lab ran the same samples and came back with the same result. Match. Brennan pulled every record she could find on Walter Hutchins. He'd moved to Manistee in 1968, about 2 years after Rosaline's murder. Before that, he'd been living in Traverse City, working odd jobs. No criminal record, no red flags, nothing to suggest he was capable of violence. But the science didn't lie. She briefed Chief of Police Dennis Morrow, who listened in disbelief. "Walt Hutchins, you're sure?" "DNA doesn't care how nice someone seems," Brennan replied. They contacted the county prosecutor's office. An arrest warrant was drafted, but they moved carefully. Hutchins was 73 years old. He'd been a respected member of the community for decades. If they botched this, if the case fell apart in court, it would be a disaster. They built their case methodically. They confirmed Hutchins had been in the area in 1966. They re-interviewed old witnesses. They prepared for every possible defense his lawyer might raise. And on the 12th of November, 2009, almost exactly 43 years after, Rosaline Santoro disappeared, Detective Sarah Brennan and a team of officers walked into Hutchins' hardware. Walter was behind the counter, ringing up a customer's purchase of light bulbs and duct tape. He looked up and smiled when he saw the officers. "Morning, folks. What can I do for you?" Brennan showed him the warrant. "Walter Hutchins, you're under arrest for the murder of Rosaline Santoro." The smile didn't leave his face right away. For a moment, it seemed like he thought it was some kind of joke. Then, reality set in. The color drained from his face. His hands started trembling. He didn't resist, didn't run, just stood there, frozen, as the handcuffs clicked into place. The customer he'd been helping stood there, slack-jawed, watching the man who'd sold her light bulbs get arrested for murder. I want to know what's the weather like where you are right now. Sunny? Raining? Snowing? Drop it in the comments. The news spread through Manistee like a shockwave. By noon, everyone knew. Walt Hutchins, of all people, had been arrested for murder. Not just any murder. The murder of Rosaline Santoro, a case that had haunted the town for over 4 decades. It didn't seem possible. People stood in clusters on street corners, in grocery store aisles, outside the post office, trying to make sense of it. Phones rang off the hook. The local radio station interrupted regular programming to report the arrest. By evening, news vans from Grand Rapids and Traverse City had descended on Manistee. Cameras pointed at the hardware store, now cordoned off with police tape. But perhaps no one was more stunned than the people who'd known Walter Hutchins best, or thought they had. Walter Allen Hutchins was born in Flint, Michigan, in 1936, the youngest of 4 children. His father worked at a GM plant. His mother was a homemaker. By all accounts, his childhood was unremarkable. He'd served briefly in the Army in the late 1952nd, received an honorable discharge, and bounced around Michigan for the next several years, working construction, factory jobs, whatever, paid the bills. In 1965, he was living in Traverse City, about 60 miles north of Manistee, working as a handyman. He kept to himself. No close friends, no serious relationships. Just a quiet, forgettable guy trying to get by. And on the 17th of November 1966, for reasons that would never be fully explained, Walter Hutchins drove to Manistee. Investigators would later piece together a theory based on evidence and circumstantial details. Hutchins had done some contract work in Manistee earlier that year, roofing repairs on a commercial building. He'd been in town. He knew the layout. He knew the quiet streets. He may have even seen Rosaline before. Maybe he'd eaten at the Silver Moon Diner during one of his trips. Maybe he'd watched her work. Maybe he'd developed a fixation. Or maybe, and this was the theory that haunted Detective Brennan, it was completely random. Wrong place, wrong time. A predator crossing paths with prey. What they knew for certain was this. On that cold November night, Walter Hutchins encountered Rosaline Santoro somewhere along her walk home. Whether he'd been waiting for her, whether he'd offered her a ride, whether he'd approached her under some pretense, those details died with Rosaline. But the DNA under her fingernails told the rest of the story. She'd fought back. The autopsy from 1967, which Brennan had re-examined, noted defensive wounds on Rosaline's hands. Scratches, broken nails. She'd clawed at her attacker, trying desperately to escape. And in doing so, she'd sealed his fate 43 years later. After killing her, Hutchins had dumped her body in the woods outside town, likely hoping it would never be found. When it was discovered 4 months later, he'd already moved on, literally. By mid-1968, he'd relocated to Manistee permanently, bought the hardware store, and started building his new life. A life built on a lie. At the Manistee County Jail, Walter Hutchins sat across from Detective Brennan in a windowless interrogation room. He'd been read his rights. He'd declined to call a lawyer, at least initially. Brennan laid the evidence out in front of him. The DNA results, the forensic reports, the timeline. We know it was you, Walter. Your DNA was under her fingernails. There's no way around that. Hutchins stared at the table. His hands, those same hands that had helped so many people over the years, trembled slightly. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, in a voice so quiet Brennan almost missed it, he said, "I didn't mean for it to happen." Brennan leaned forward. "What didn't you mean to happen?" Hutchins rubbed his face. He looked older than 73 inches that moment, ancient, hollowed out. "I just wanted to talk to her. That's all. Just talk." "So, what happened?" He was silent again. Then, "She got scared, started yelling. I panicked. I didn't know what to do." "So you killed her?" Hutchins flinched at the words but didn't deny them. "I didn't mean to. I swear I didn't mean to." It was as close to a confession as they were going to get, at least before his lawyer shut it down. Within hours, Hutchins had legal representation, and the talking stopped. But it didn't matter. The DNA was ironclad. Outside the jail, the community was in freefall. Parents who'd entrusted their children to Walter Hutchins, who'd let him coach their sons, who'd watched him cheer from the bleachers, who'd sent their kids to his store to buy supplies for school projects, felt sick. Had their children been in danger all those years? Barbara Kelly, whose son had played on the Little League team Hutchins sponsored, spoke to a local reporter with tears streaming down her face. "He drove my son home from practice. He was in our house. I made him dinner. How do you reconcile that? How do you look at someone for 30 years and never see the monster underneath?" Richard Dern, a deacon at First Baptist Church who'd served alongside Hutchins for 2 decades, was equally shattered. "We prayed together. We served communion together. I thought I knew him. I thought he was a man of God. How could I be so wrong?" The hardware store became a grim tourist attraction. People drove by slowly, staring, taking pictures. Some left flowers on the sidewalk, not for Hutchins, but for Rosaline. A makeshift memorial grew outside the shop. Candles, photos of Rosaline from 1966, handwritten notes that said things like, "Justice at last," and "We won't forget you, Rosie." Marie Santoro, Rosaline's younger sister, was contacted by police in Ohio. She'd waited 43 years for this moment, and when it finally came, she didn't feel the relief she'd expected. "I'm glad they caught him," she told reporters. "I'm glad he'll finally pay for what he did. But my sister is still gone. My parents died without knowing. That doesn't change." Vincent Santoro, Rosaline's father, had passed away in 2003, just 6 years before the arrest. He died believing his daughter's killer would never be found. At a press conference, Detective Brennan stood beside Chief Morrow and the county prosecutor, facing a room packed with journalists and community members. "This case is a testament to the power of perseverance and modern forensic science," Brennan said. Rosaline Santoro's voice was silenced in 1966, but the evidence she left behind finally spoke. "Justice delayed is painful, but it's not justice denied. Today, we can say with certainty, we know who killed Rosaline Santoro, and he will be held accountable." The applause that followed was tentative, muted. People didn't know whether to cheer or cry. Because yes, the killer had been caught, but he'd been hiding among them for 3 decades, smiling, helping, pretending, and nobody had known. The state of Michigan charged Walter Allen Hutchins with first-degree murder on the 19th of November 2009. The evidence was overwhelming. The DNA match, the partial confession during the initial interrogation, the timeline that placed him in the area, the forensic analysis that confirmed Rosaline had fought her attacker before she died. Hutchins' defense attorney, a seasoned criminal lawyer named Martin Voss from Grand Rapids, knew he was facing an uphill battle, but he wasn't going to roll over. Voss filed a motion to suppress the confession, arguing it had been coerced. The judge denied it. He challenged the DNA evidence, bringing in his own expert to question the reliability of testing samples that were over 40 years old. The prosecution's forensic experts testified that the samples had been properly stored and that the results were scientifically sound. The judge allowed the evidence. Voss tried to negotiate a plea deal, second-degree murder, a reduced sentence given Hutchins' age and lack of prior criminal history. The prosecution refused. This was first-degree murder, premeditated, and they were going to prove it. In March 2010, the trial began at the Manistee County Courthouse. The courtroom was packed every single day. Reporters, curious locals, families of other cold case victims who saw this trial as a symbol of hope, and Marie Santoro, Rosaline's sister, who flew in from Ohio and sat in the front row, her eyes never leaving Walter Hutchins. The prosecution, led by Assistant Attorney General Patricia Langford, laid out their case with precision. They presented the DNA evidence first. Dr. Michael Chen. Wait, I need to use a different name. Dr. Michael Patterson, a forensic DNA analyst from the Michigan State Police Lab, walked the jury through the science. He explained how DNA is extracted, how profiles are built, how matches are confirmed. He testified that the DNA found under Rosaline's fingernails matched Walter Hutchins' profile with a probability of 1 in 4.7 billion. To put it simply, Dr. Patterson said, the DNA under Rosaline Santoro's fingernails belongs to the defendant. There is no reasonable doubt. The defense tried to poke holes in the science. Voss questioned the chain of custody. Had the evidence been contaminated? Could someone else's DNA have been introduced accidentally? Dr. Patterson was unshakable. The evidence was sealed in 1967, and remained sealed until 2009. The integrity of the samples was never compromised. Next, the prosecution called Detective Sarah Brennan. She walked the jury through her investigation, how she'd found the evidence, how she'd pursued the DNA testing, how the match had led to Hutchins. "When I saw his name come back as a match," Brennan testified, "I couldn't believe it. But the science doesn't care about reputations. It only cares about truth." The prosecution played the recording of Hutchins' interrogation. The jury heard his voice, quiet and trembling. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I just wanted to talk to her. She got scared." The defense argued it wasn't a confession, just the confused ramblings of an old man blindsided by an accusation. But the damage was done. Langford called witnesses who'd seen Rosaline that night, the man walking his dog, who'd spoken to her, the diner cook who'd watched her leave. She established the timeline, the route, the window of opportunity. Then she called the medical examiner who'd performed Rosaline's autopsy in 1967. He was retired now, in his 80s, but his memory was sharp. "The cause of death was asphyxiation due to strangulation," he testified. "Manual strangulation, likely with the assailant's hands." The victim fought back. The defensive wounds on her hands and the skin cells under her nails were consistent with someone trying to fight off an attacker. The courtroom was silent. The defense's strategy was limited. They couldn't dispute the DNA. They couldn't explain away the confession. So Voss tried to humanize Hutchins, to paint him as a man who'd made one terrible mistake and spent the rest of his life trying to atone for it through good works. He called character witnesses, people who'd known Walt for decades, the pastor from First Baptist Church, parents of Little League players, customers from the hardware store. They all said the same things. Walt was kind, generous, helpful. He'd never shown any signs of violence. But Langford dismantled that narrative on cross-examination. "Did Walter Hutchins ever tell you he killed Rosaline Santoro?" she asked each witness. "No." "Did he ever express remorse for what he did?" "No." "So he lied to you. For 30 years, he looked you in the eye, smiled, helped your children, attended your church, all while knowing he'd strangled a young woman and dumped her body in the woods. That's not atonement, that's deception." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty. First-degree murder. When the verdict was read, Walter Hutchins showed no emotion. He simply stared straight ahead, his face blank, as if he'd already left his body. "Marie," Santoro wept. At sentencing 2 weeks later, the judge allowed victim impact statements. Marie stood at the podium, her hands gripping the edges to keep them from shaking. "My sister was 22 years old," she said, her voice breaking. "She had dreams. She was saving money for school. She was kind and funny and full of life. And you took that from her. You took her from us. My mother died without ever knowing what happened. My father spent the last 30 years of his life broken. You stole more than my sister's life. You stole our peace. You stole our closure, and you did it while pretending to be a good man. That might be the cruelest part of all." The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Judith Kramer, looked down at Hutchins with barely concealed disgust. "Mr. Hutchins, you were given a gift that most murderers never receive, the gift of time. You had 43 years of freedom that you didn't deserve. You built a life, earned respect, and enjoyed the trust of a community you betrayed in the worst possible way. The only reason you're sitting here today is because Rosaline Santoro fought back. She left evidence on her body that eventually led us to you. She solved her own murder. You will spend the rest of your life in prison. Court is adjourned." Walter Hutchins was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was led out of the courtroom in shackles, his head down, as spectators watched in silence. Justice, after 43 years, had finally arrived. Justice delayed isn't always justice denied. If you believe in the power of perseverance and science, share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe, we're just getting started. The arrest and conviction of Walter Hutchins left Manistee, Michigan, forever changed. It wasn't just about solving a murder. It was about the fracture of trust, the realization that evil doesn't always announce itself with warning signs. Sometimes it wears a friendly smile, sponsors the local baseball team, and asks how your kids are doing in school. In the months following the trial, the town struggled to process what had happened. Therapy groups formed for parents whose children had been coached by Hutchins. The hardware store sat empty for over a year, before finally being sold and reopened under new ownership with a different name. First Baptist Church held a special service dedicated to healing and reflection. Some people left Manistee entirely, unable to reconcile the place they'd loved with the darkness that had been hiding beneath its surface. But others stayed, and in staying, found a way to honor Rosaline's memory. A scholarship fund was established in Rosaline Santoro's name, awarded annually to a young woman from Manistee High School pursuing higher education. It was the dream Rosie never got to fulfill, now made possible for others. A small memorial garden was created in downtown Manistee, a quiet space with a bench and a plaque that read, "In memory of Rosaline Santoro, 1944 to 1966, gone but never forgotten." Justice found her. Marie Santoro returned to Manistee for the dedication. She hadn't set foot in her hometown in nearly 40 years, but standing in that garden, surrounded by people who still remembered her sister, she finally felt something she hadn't felt in decades. Peace. Not the peace of forgetting, the peace of knowing. "I spent most of my life angry," Marie told a local reporter. Angry at the person who took her. Angry at the police for not solving it sooner. Angry at God for letting it happen. "But now, I'm just tired, and I'm grateful. Grateful that we finally know. Grateful that he can't hurt anyone else. Grateful that Rosie's story didn't end in silence." The case also became a turning point in how law enforcement agencies across Michigan and the country approached cold cases. Detective Sarah Brennan became something of a reluctant advocate, speaking at law enforcement conferences about the importance of preserving evidence and revisiting old cases with modern technology. "DNA is a game changer," Brennan would say in interviews, "but it only works if the evidence is still there. Every cold case file needs to be reviewed. Every piece of biological evidence needs to be catalogued and protected, because technology will keep advancing, and what we can't test today, we might be able to test tomorrow." Inspired by Rosaline's case, Michigan State Police created a dedicated cold case DNA initiative in 2011, prioritizing the retesting of biological evidence in unsolved homicides. Within 5 years, the program had solved 17 cases, some dating back to the 1970s. Families who'd spent decades without answers were finally getting closure. Killers who thought they'd gotten away with it were being held accountable. Rosaline's case became a blueprint, a symbol of what persistence, science, and refusal to give up could accomplish. Walter Hutchins, meanwhile, disappeared into the prison system. He was transferred to a maximum security facility in southern Michigan, where he lived out his days in relative obscurity. Some inmates knew who he was, what he'd done. Others didn't care. In prison, everyone's got a past. He rarely received visitors. No family came forward to support him. The friends he'd made in Manistee wanted nothing to do with him. He spent most of his time in the prison library, reading westerns and old mysteries. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. In 2016, 7 years after his conviction, Walter Hutchins died of a heart attack at the age of 80. There was no funeral, no obituary in the Manistee paper. His body was cremated, and his ashes were disposed of by the state. He died the way he'd lived for most of his life, hiding the truth. But Rosaline's story didn't die with him. Her case is still cited in forensic science courses, in cold case training seminars, in true crime documentaries. She's become more than a victim. She's a reminder that evidence doesn't forget. That science can reach back through time. That justice, even when delayed, is still worth fighting for. For families of other cold case victims, Rosaline's story offers something invaluable. Hope. Hope that their loved ones won't be forgotten. Hope that advancing technology might one day crack the case that's haunted them for years. Hope that somewhere, in a dusty evidence box, there's a piece of DNA, or a fingerprint, or a fiber that will finally tell the truth. Rosaline Santoro never got to go to secretarial school. She never got to marry Tommy Callahan or anyone else. She never got to grow old, have children, watch sunsets over Lake Michigan with grandkids on her lap. But in a strange and bittersweet way, she got something else. She got justice, and her voice silenced for 43 years finally got heard. Rosaline Santoro waited 43 years for justice. Thousands of families are still waiting. If this story moved you, Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and don't forget to like and subscribe so we can keep telling these important stories together. On a cold November night in 1966, Rosaline Santoro walked out of a diner and into the darkness, never knowing it would be her last journey home. For 43 years, her killer walked free, hiding behind a smile, a handshake, and a carefully constructed lie. But Rosaline fought back. And in fighting back, she left behind the evidence that would eventually bring him down. Her story reminds us that no case is ever truly cold, that technology evolves, that dedicated investigators refuse to give up, and that sometimes justice takes decades, but it still comes. If this story resonated with you, let me know in the comments. Share it with someone who believes in the power of truth. And stay tuned, because next week, we're diving into another case that'll leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Until then, stay safe out there, and never stop seeking the truth.